Yours.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. They just.
All right. Come to order.
Dun, dun, dun.
All right. So I have the pleasure of introducing Jason Larsen, 14 hours and electric grid. You probably need the whole 14 hours anyway. So his bio says that Jason Larsen, aka the other Jason. And as I was reading that, I was like, what do you mean by that? Is he like the one who goes like this? Or within this Jason Larsen, and then the other Jason, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of those. But,
yeah.
He's been hacking just control systems since before it was cool. Actually, the hacking that you're doing on that, remember with IML and others, has helped to make it cool, right? So this is the cool trend of people here. Over his career, he's focused on the highly technical parts of the field, starting out intrusion detection systems and ending up as a bug hunter and penetration tester. Some career highlights include his record IML, a few years on the Windows 7 penetration testing team. Did you find any vulnerabilities in there?
No, a few. Yes, a few. Yes.
And driving some larger moving machines into a bomb. Okay, there's you with a vulnerability on that one. Okay,
yes.
Jason currently works for IOActive as a principal consultant, where he splits his time between major tech companies and abusing big, spinny, and burning things wherever they need to be in the world. Okay, so let's hear about the spinny and burning things.
Okay.
Jason Larsen.
Okay. Oh, thanks. So, yeah, reporters. So I haven't done any presentations for a couple of years now, and so so I've been kind of out of the loop. But I found a bunch of bugs last year. I find hundreds of bugs a year, and most of the bugs that I find never go into anything. So the vast majority of the bugs don't ever get assigned to CVE. They don't get press. They don't get any of that type of stuff. And so, unfortunately, since none of the stuff gets into the press, then what C-level execs read to understand what they need to go do is based on a lot of really bad things. And so every now and then we're forced to go talk to the press, and it always goes pretty much the same way. The press is like, please tell me something that I can take out of context. And so I'm over here talking to one of these press guys and saying, well, I found a bunch of these bugs, and they would be used to take over this chemical process if you've already hacked in. And he's like, oh, yes, all those little kitties in their bedrooms will take over the critical infrastructure and havoc. I'm like, no, that's not really it. And then he's like, oh, evil nation state people, they'll take over everything. Please say the words Russia and China so that I can, throw a bunch of stuff together. And I tried to bring them down, but just wasn't happening because they're the press, and they pretty much make their living making outrageous statements. So I was writing up my rebuttal to the to this this article, and it occurred to me I didn't have anything that I could point out to you, like what's just a normal gig? What does a normal average security guy do during the average day? What does he find? How does it work out? How long does it take? All those types of things. So I decided to do a presentation on just kind of a normal gig. What's happening? What do I spend my time on? And stuff like that. So I'm going to cover what an engagement looked like, what exploits it generated, how long did it take, what techniques I used, etc. So on my next engagement, I started off a diary, and I took notes on what I was doing every hour of the engagement. And so this presentation is going to cover those first 14 hours on particular engagement. So in this case, there's a power utility that allows me to go hack into a live power grid every couple of years. So the guy there has a super strong stomach, and he's just like, go for it, take over my power grid. And so I really enjoy myself. So in the previous gig, I'd hacked into the power grid over the mobile device management system. So everybody that runs out to deal with the substations now actually has laptops, and of course they bought one of the major vendors' management things so they can patch it and make sure there's no bad stuff on it or whatever else. And so I tore it apart, found some bugs, took over the server in there, and wormed my way out there until eventually I got into the EMS network over here. And so this is where the operators sit and they run the actual power grid. And then that talks to a bunch of big boxes that do the math and predict what the power is going to be for the day, etc. And then that talks over to a data DMZ. And so the data DMZ is all the things that talk out to all the substations in the world. So usually have a bunch of firewalls and stuff here, and here's a bunch of other firewalls and stuff that make it so you can't get from the corporate network into the EMS network. And then this talks out of over the fiber optic cables and the lines and microwave relays and everything else out there until you get into the substation. The substation, you have a remote terminal unit, and they did have IP down in the substation, and antivirus and all that fun stuff. So I was continuing on with the attack, and in this case, I need to get from the EMS network down into the substation where all the big zappy things are, to disable the sanity checks in the system. So the attack that was positive, and all the safety system built down in here, even up here as the operator, you say, go do bad things to the power grid, and this stuff would just kick things off and say, no, not today. So the scenario was I was supposed to hack down through all of this stuff down into the substation and disable all of the stuff that was going to stop me from doing bad things all the way up here. So most of the stuff in electric power is actually still serial, because you stick stuff into substations and you don't want to touch it for 20 years. The entire cost proposition is stick it in, don't touch it. So you have a bunch of those. So everybody has a rack of a bunch of these things in it. So this is a Moxa Ethernet to serial converter. So you've got a LAN interface that comes down. This is exposes a bunch of TCP ports on it, and each one of these is a serial port on the back, and you plug the serial ports on here into all the things going down into your substations. And so since it's all serial down there, I can't actually send commands from here all the way down in there directly. I'm going to have to take over something here and then stick stuff on the serial protocols, and then take the guy over there over the serial protocol. So I can't like ping stuff down in the substations because this is an IP connection. So I had to start here on this box. And so my presentation is the first stop in this. So eventually I broke into that, took over the RTU, took over the antivirus or the IDS in there, because the substation was broken into two halves. One that actually runs the power, one that runs the safety of it. But the intrusion detection system was plugged onto both LANs. So I just took over the intrusion detection to get from the thing that ran the power to the thing that actually did the safety of the system. I've got this box. So they walk by and they're like, yeah, the serial cables are plugged into this thing, chunk. And I've never actually looked at one. So I started looking at it, and just as an interesting side note, this is also supposedly the same box that in the Ukrainian hack of 2015 that whoever attacked the Ukrainians zeroed out the firmware on and turned off the power over there. So I had a little bit of a problem. So hour one comes up. So what's the first thing that I did? I did the same thing that everybody from professionals to kiddies do, is I nmat scanned it. And what you found was a whole bunch of open TCP ports. These lead to all of the various serial ports. Has Telnet and HTTP and DHCP and SNMP, well-known services. And we got a few services here that we don't know what they are. We got 4800, 4900, and 949. So I had no idea what those guys were. So, but it has a web server on it, so and a telnet server. So I decided let's try there. So you telnet to it, and you get a nice prompt that says, "Please key in your password." I was like, "Okay, password." I also looked at the web server. When you go to the web server, it has this thing over here that says "Key in your password." So I had one of those. I'd set up a password and everything there. And when you log into it, it gives you this nice web console for changing the serial port settings and baud rates and all the other things that you have to do in the middle there. So the next thing I did was I went out to Moxa's website and tried to get any documentation I could on this one. So if you go look down here under the Moxa 5160, they have firmware downloads, which is score for me, and this little Windows administration tool up there. And so you hook this guy up, and this is how you do firmware upgrades. This is how you map serial ports on this. If you want the serial port to appear like it's a local serial port on your Windows box, it'll do things like that for you. So there's the Windows utility and a firmware update, and some documentation that was really kind of Englishy. So I poked at it a little bit. I'm like, what kind of box is this? Is this a Linux box? Is it running Windows CE? Is it running VxWorks? I mean, what kind of box was it? And so I pinged it and took a look at it. And if you look here, like on the initial acknowledgement numbers, these are increasing by small integers based on time. And it's like, nobody's done this since the 90s. So like way back in the 1990s or late 80s, people used to have TCP IP stacks that had nice predictable sequence numbers like this, but we haven't seen this for years and years. So it's not Linux, it's not VxWorks, it's not any modern operating system that I could find. It's not even the little lightweight IP or micro IP you download and put into embedded boxes. It's something that they wrote themselves. So I decided that the easiest way in, web servers are usually good for a few laughs. So I pulled up a burp sweep and I tried to look at the login. So like, maybe if I can log in, I can find some bugs here. I can take it over. So, so the first thing I did was looked at the authentication, and the authentication was actually kind of weird. So when you get the login page, it sends you over a random number, and you take the random number and your password, and you MD5 those two back together, and then you stick a cookie in your browser, and you stick that cookie in the HTTP reply, and that logs you into the box. And so I tried a few other things here, like I tried to post directly to the password change fields to see if they were authenticated, a bunch of other stuff, but I mostly got nowhere. And couldn't get in over the web interface. So that was the end of the first hour, and I wasn't feeling too awesome with myself because I hadn't found any really good ways in. So I decided I needed to look for a new way into this box. So I started looking at the Windows software that talked to it. So I did the firmware upgrade, and so you click on the box and you actually have to unlock it before you can do the upgrade. And so you right click on it and you say unlock this thing, and you type in your password and it unlocks, and then you can do a firmware upgrade. And once it's unlocked, you can exit the software and go back in. So the locking isn't based on a session at all. So it's either in the lock state or the unlock state. So if you unlock it, you can also then upgrade a firmware from another IP address, which is always terribly interesting. So so I popped in there and I looked at the startup traffic. And so running through there, then here we saw a bunch of the traffic going to this mystery port 4800 that we saw in there. And it went back and forth, and this is UDP protocol. In the middle, we see the model numbers from it and stuff like that. It's like, that's interesting. We can get a hold of that. So I also did the unlock, and the unlock came over here and actually talks to port 4900 on the this undocumented port 4900. And then looking at the things going back, the packets sending back and forth look a whole lot like the MD5 challenge that happened on the web interface. So it's like, that's interesting. So I actually went through the firmware upgrade. The firmware upgrade process, and it starts the firmware upgrade. It sends a couple of hello messages back and forth, and then it sends this little short packet, and then it just starts dumping bytes into the device. And so I counted up the number of bytes that were there, and if you look at the number of bytes in hex, it sent over a firmware of 686 hex bytes worth of firmware update. And if you look in the packet right here, you can see, that must be a length field because it's got a 686 bytes there. So pretty much it's sending a, hey, how are you doing? Yeah, I'm great. Aren't we two cool dudes? And have a big firmware update blob that's this big, and then you shove the firmware update over there. So I went and I looked at the firmware update I downloaded off the website. And this is the firmware upgrade file, and we can see that it's unencrypted because we can read a whole bunch of these text things over there. So score, I'm not going to have to work my way through any compression or encryption type stuff, so it's just nice and flat. And the firmware update started right here, and this is byte for byte what gets sent over the wire. So what's sending over the wire is this on in the firmware. So I carved this off and said this is what gets sent over the wire. So that must be the firmware update. Looking at it a little bit, then almost all updates have a header that tell you about the firmware update. So this is probably the magic number because it has this nice human readable HEP in the middle here. And this number right here is really close to the little Indian representation of the number of bytes in it. So this is 066868, and the original one from the traffic dump was 068888. And so if you subtract the two, then that's a hex 20 difference. And here we have hex 20 hanging out right next to the next field. So I surmised that when they were dumping this, then there must be a 20 byte header on here, or a 32 byte header, 20 hex bytes, followed by the firmware. So, and if you look at here, so you have the header, a whole bunch of zeros, and then you finally start getting numbers of various types. So it was a 20-byte header. So I carved off the first 20 bytes, and I threw it in IDA, and said, I think this is going to be ARM Little Endian, because the most common processor on embedded devices is Little Endian ARM, and crank this into IDA, and out popped the binary, and now I could sit down and read through the binary. So I'm not going to go through all of this stuff. So pretty much I spent 2 hours reading through the binary. So I'll give you the turbo version of reading through the binary. So the first thing I did was loaded it up, and inside the binary there have lots and lots of debugging messages. And so that told me a lot about what these functions did. So I went through all the things that I talked about, and I started naming the functions. This is the TCP server mode, etc. And then I went through the string table. I started looking for things that talk to it. So since we know this thing talks on the network, then we know that it's going to have a TCP/IP stack, and it's going to have to make a bunch of TCP/IP relevant calls. And so I went looking for strings that had to do with this. So here we have TCP servers, UDP servers, things that we would want to know about. After looking at it a little bit, I went and I found the various BSD functions. So we have socket, host network short. So if you do any internet programming in low-level languages, you know that when you open up a TCP socket, then you, in the Unix world, you call socket, then bind, then listen, then read and write, etc. So here we have called a socket, which is creating a new port to talk out on the internet thing. And here we have 4800, which is our listening port. So this has to be the routine that creates the UDP 4800 service that we saw listening over there. So mystery solved here. We've got the 4800 service. Likewise, I found the port 4900 service, and that little 949 custom service that was running there. So now I've isolated the routines that actually handle those. So then when we look at the inside the routines, so this happens to be the routine that handles that UDP parser. So if we look up here, it's pulling stuff out of the packets. So here we have this receive from, where it's reading a bunch of bytes off of the wire into this 1024 byte buffer. So we know that it's going to receive a UDP packet. That packet's going to be at up to 1024 bytes big. It's going to come over here, and it's going to take 2 bytes out of it, starting at byte number 2, and swap those, and that turns into a length field. So we know that bytes 3 and 4 starting from 0, it's going to be 2 and 3, or 3 and 4 if you start from 1, are going to be the length field. Then it does a mem copy on this 12 byte, or a mem compare thing on the this 12 bytes over here. So we know that there's some sort of session token in the middle here, and it's going to be 12 bytes long. So we know kind of what it is. And then if we look here, it takes the first byte out of here and drops into the switch statement. And so this is the type of the packet there. And so looking here, then there's 100 and some odd different messages that this UDP port can handle. So I've kind of teased out the structure of this message. So I started playing with the messages and going through each one of them and looking at it. And so after I went down here, I got to message hex 1F and started looking at it, and it didn't make a lot of sense. It's like, what is this? This looks really interesting. Maybe I can actually use this. And here in the message of the body, they're pulling out a 4-byte value that here's a pointer. They're pulling out a length field and data. And if we actually look into the function it calls over there, it's actually mem copying from that pointer into the output packet and sending it back. So this is a debug function. So this is for the programmer. He wants to see something going on inside of the device. He comes over and says, hey, go read the memory at this address and give it back to me, because I want to see what's happening inside this device. And so I'm like, I can use that. So I turned around and I whipped up a little bit of Python, which is right here, that turned around and said, well, go give me 16 bytes from every address in the box. And so basically dumping the entire memory. So give me the 16 bytes, give me the next 16 bytes, and give me the next 16 bytes. And so I dumped all of it, and I went looking around through memory, and lo and behold, what's sitting over here in memory but the password for the device. And so every time you get you break a box, every pen tester has his own little happy dance. Mine has a little butt wiggle in it, and so so I do the little happy dance of like, woohoo, we have butt wiggle. Go ahead. Yes. So it turns out that this if you want the little bit greater detail here, if you actually look at the decode here, so you see if you have this if pointer is less than 0, which is just kind of a weird constraint on it. And so what it's actually checking to see is if the pointer is less than or is greater than 0x80000, which is the top half of memory. And this is actually pretty common in microcontrollers because a lot of microcontrollers, when you have flash memory, they automatically map the flash memory into the address space. So when you're reading up in memory inside a microcontroller, you actually have the RAM, the memory, but you also have all the flash storage. And so what this is there for is to restrict you to reading just the flash storage part of RAM. And one of the reasons that people do that is because besides flash and RAM, you also have a memory mapped I/O section. So when you interact with the peripherals, like you're going to reboot it or turn on and off a serial port or something like that, then most microcontrollers actually has a memory mapped I/O range. And so you just write a value to that range of memory, and the silicon picks up that value and then reconfigures the serial port for you. So reading through all of memory is actually not a non-destructive process on most microcontrollers because there'll be just a spot in memory, and if you want to read off of a serial port, you actually read the same byte over and over again, and the silicon interprets that read to popping bytes off the serial buffer. If you want to write to it, then you write to the same byte in memory over and over again, and the bytes pop out the serial port. And so most likely what this restriction is here therefore is for the programmer not to oops and read through the memory mapped I/O section and then change the state of the device while he's debugging it. So what this actually is this is in the internal flash on the chip. Is the configuration section. And so this is the section sitting right here. And you can see one of the same headers that we had in the other section over there. So this is the section of flash that actually contains all the configuration data, including the password. And so we dumped all this out, and lo and behold, we have Moxa password in the middle of it, and we can now remotely read the password without knowing the password because the UDP port is unauthenticated. So after I found that and I dumped the memory, then I came up with an evil genius plan. So I have all the things that I need now. So I have the password. I can unlock the device with it. I have a copy of the firmware. I can upload my evil Trojan firmware into the middle of this, and I can take it over. And then once I take over the device, I can start trying to send exploits down the serial wire to take over the RTU in the middle there. Since I can't just take it over by talking to via IP, I can get onto this box, and this box can act as a springboard for me to go attack the RTU and get down into the substation. So this also has the added benefit that if I'm on this box, all the communications is going through this box. So so I can also man in the middle of the communication. So later on, when I need to actually make it so the operator can't see what I'm doing in the substation, so I'm reconfiguring all the things in the substation. I don't want the operator to have a thing that says, "Oh, the substation just got reconfigured. You should do something about that." So don't want any of that to go on. So I'm also in a place where I can filter all that stuff out of the stream. So I'm feeling pretty good right now, and so I hit hour 6, and then this is the really sweaty palm stage for any time you're doing one of these. The reason it's the sweaty palm stage is because when I modify the firmware and I upload the new firmware, the thing that uploads the new firmware is the firmware. And so if you break the firmware, and so you change the firmware and it breaks it and the thing doesn't boot anymore, you're done. There's no program running anymore for you to talk to upload a new firmware to fix your mistake. And so you get the this is the real sweaty palm stage of like, I want to, oh, go ahead. So you pretty much just have one chance. You could bring up QEMU and try to emulate the things, but like at this point, I don't know what chip's in here. So I actually did pop the top off of one of these, and the chip just has Moxa on the top. So I don't have spec sheets for the chip or anything. All I know it's an ARM processor. So I can't really sandbox it. Plus, how you actually talk to it's not like a Linux-based operating system. How you talk to the serial ports is all through this memory map I/O region. So you actually have to know that this spot in memory here, and you have to program that up to emulate all the things. And so there's no real way to sandbox it and test it out. So when you make the first modification to your firmware, then you're always like, ugh, because these are about $1,000 a piece new. And so, yeah, go ahead. Yep, and oh yeah, and iOctave does that. We decap chips. We've got focused ion beams, electron microscopes, and stuff, and we do that that part of stuff. But that takes a lot of effort to go through, and probably more dollars than the thousands that I would brick in the middle there. Since by the time you actually decap a chip and understand enough to find the flash, and then you have to actually go in with a focused ion beam and actually build up traces. So you cut the traces to the main chip from the flash, and you actually build up little traces over the top of the chip, and you build a little pad and a little pad and a little pad, and you drop some little micro wires down there, and then you talk to the internal flash. And so by the time you're in doing that, you're into it 120 hours, which is more expensive than bricking a few boxes. But yeah, it can be done. So the next thing I did is I wanted to automate the uploads, and so I just spent a few minutes figuring out the same thing in the TCP port, and the unlock was just that. So when you talk to the unlock, it has an opcode up here. It was opcode 0001, I think. Oh no, 1004. And you send it over there. It sends you a challenge, which is just a random number. You MD5 the password and the random number together, and that unlocks the device. So so I just whipped up a little script that would actually unlock the device, and also a little one that would upload the firmware. So I didn't have to go through the little GUI thing all the time to upload the firmware. Yeah, I think I went over this yeah, this is the real clunchy part, because if you mess up, then you have to go to the guy and it's like, can I have another expensive $1,000 device? Thank you. I just broke that one. So what was my first modification? So the first modification. So yes, I decided to go forward with the modifications, and so they actually did give me 3 of them, so I had like 2 for free. So they did say they wanted them back in a working order, but I said I couldn't promise that. So yeah, so they actually only gave me 1 of the RTUs. But that was Linux based, and so it was much easier.
Was there any open source information about the design, or did you look, the specs in terms of?
I went through their website and stuff, but yeah, I couldn't find any open source information, but on it. But that's usually pretty typical when we hit these things. Is most of the time these things are just full on black boxes. Nobody's ever looked at them before. So the first modification I did is earlier when I tell it into the box, it gives me this nice nice prompt. And so I want to make a really small change that I can actually see to see if it worked. Because sometimes you throw up firmware and you think it uploaded, but it didn't really upload, and all those things. And so here we have the please key in your password. And so I changed it to see please key AA your password. And I went over there and says, let's upload this thing. And I actually did this one with the GUI, and it's like file format error. So your modification isn't there. So there's something checking the integrity of this update. So I went back to the binary and looked at how it was doing the firmware updates. And there's actually a checksum right here in the header, right next to the magic number and the length, and then the header size. And right after that, we have a checksum. And so it turns out that the checksum is actually just taking all of the bytes in it, casting it as an array of 32-bit to integers, and adding them up. And that turns into the checksum. So this type of checksum, though, nobody's used for years and years, because it has one very big problem. And the one very big problem is that if you have a big block of just all zeros and you add up a whole bunch of zeros, the sum of all the zeros is going to be 0. And so if you tend to just plaster, your software freaks out and just sends a whole bunch of zeros out to a box, then the 0 checksum, all the zeros will add up with the 0 checksum, and then you end up writing zeros all over the flash and you brick your box. So that sounds curiously like what happened over here in the Ukrainian hacks. And so my guess is that these lazy dudes didn't actually reverse engineer the firmware very much, and just accidentally bricked it, and then like, hey, we have a bricker. So yes, my respect for those guys went down a notch after I had So I changed the checksum, I re-uploaded the firmware, I tell it into it, and lo and behold, we have please key AA your password. So now I know that I can make modifications to the firmware, I can upload the firmware, and it's all good. So now I can get concentrate on actually writing a firmware update. So then for hour 7, 8, the next 2 hours, then we're working on baby's first memory implant. So the first thing I always do is write an in-memory debugger. So as I'm making modifications in the middle of this and I want to do stuff, I need a way to reach in and figure out if I'm right. So I stick like little printfs in the code so I can see what's happening and a bunch of those types of things. So what we want is something that's a very minimal set of modifications that we upload into the firmware. And then we actually use commands to manipulate the rest of the RAM. That way that we only have to really do the clinchy parts of this very small change to it until we get the much larger change right. And after we're comfortable the much larger change is right, then we commit that to Flash. And so the first the 2 modifications I made was the first thing was to take out this the check right here that was to restrict the reading to that upper half of RAM, the Flash. So I just knocked out those checks. So now I can read the entirety of the memory space. So then the second thing I did was I took a random opcode that wasn't involved in the firmware update, and I made that a write. So now I have a primitive where I can read from memory and a primitive where I can write from memory. And so I tested those out. So if you're more familiar with C, then this is actually a C decode of that. And so up here you can see the if statement is gone, and then down here I have one that comes over there and takes a pointer out and a value out of it and writes it into memory. So now I have a read and a write primitive inside the memory space. So the first thing I did with the new write primitive was just to repeat the same modification that I had done. So I uploaded it. It says, please key in your password. I say, go write an AA to right here. I write an AA to right there. And it says, please key AA your password. So now I know that the read and write actually works. So now we have the next big problem whenever you're writing an implant is where is the implant going to live? So here's a box, it's got firmware running in it, and mostly it's going to use up most of the RAM and whatever else. So I'm going to add a whole bunch of code to this box, but it has to live somewhere in RAM. And there's usually a very limited amount. Most of these things have RAM measured in kilobytes, not megabytes or gigabytes. So there's usually 3 approaches you can take for that. So the first one is you can find some unused RAM somewhere in there. And that's the best for you because it's unused. I don't have to do any tinkering. The second thing, I can come over there and say like, well, maybe this device really doesn't need this thing, like the web server. Like I could just dump all the web server out of it and then clear up some space and stick my stuff in there. The third one, which is harder, that you sometimes have to do in more advanced rootkits, is you try to move things around and compress them so you get all the same functionality, but as you move them around, you make a little bit of extra space for yourself. And so these techniques are collectively called code caves. So I have to make a code cave someplace that my stuff is going to run. Well, it turns out it was actually really easy because as I dumped RAM and I got to the end of RAM here, so between the end of where they were actually using stuff and the actual end of RAM, there was 1.7 kilobytes of unused memory. So hey, I'll take 1.7 kilobytes. I can do a whole lot of stuff with 1.7 K of RAM, or you could stick a JPEG image in there, a very small JPEG image. But each to his own. So what I did then was I used my new handy dandy memory writing tool to stick in a stub in the middle of it that calls a function at my code cave. And so now whenever I send a package over there, I can use my memory writer to write my new code through my code cave and then call this function from the UDP protocol, and it's going to jump to that and execute my code. And I can use that to do all the things, except writing everything by hand in assembly really bites. So the next thing I did was I built a cross compiler for this architecture. And so this actually was an ARM v4. So I needed to build a cross compiler for ARM v4. So I can write in a higher level language. And so, yeah, usually C is that language, and C is the best language. So I built a cross compiler, and then I also built a linker script. And so now I can actually just write in good old fashioned C. And then I wrote a linker script that makes it so the C compiler actually targets the assembly for the memory range in my code cave. So right here is my code cave. I'm saying when you compile this down, go stick all of the executable code and read-only data and stuff here inside the code cave. And so now the compiler does all the hard work of generating opcodes and optimizing the code and doing all the things. And And then all I have to do is then take the blob that's output by the compiler, stick it in the middle there, and I actually have code. And of course, then I reused in C the exact same overwrite that I did before that I can go see and telnet into it. So so I compiled that down, turns into a blob. I send the blob over up into the memory, and now I can just write any code that I want here. So now that I'm done, I have a place to stick code. I have a way to stick code into memory. Now I have to actually start building the implant inside of memory. So we have one big problem in devices like this, so it's not a problem, but one major, the first thing you got to do is, since this is just a byte shuttler, it's shuttling bytes off of the TCP port and then dropping them on the serial port and taking the other ones and going back there, throwing them over one at a time. I want to deal with things in messages. So in this case, these are DNP messages going across it. So what I have to do is write an implant that takes all the bytes off of the serial port and then buffers them up into a buffer until I get a full DNP message, so I can deal with the DNP message. And then I can either drop that message or modify it in some way and then clock it out on the TCP session. So the next chunk that I did, and I wrote this in C, was allocating some buffers and hooking the functions that do the read and writing. And so now when the function is reading off the serial port, instead of chunking over into the middle there, it drops it into my buffer. I queues it up until it looks like a DNP packet, and then I deal with it, and then I clock it back out on the serial port or the TCP port, depending on which direction it's going. So now that I have a thing that will spool up DNP packets and can modify them, I actually have to build what we call our spoofing tables. So so there's a whole bunch of things that happen when you start messing with things in the thing. So the operator can say, "Oh, this is bad." You can get alarms. This is bad. But also a whole bunch of automated things that may kick on. So while I'm down there messing with stuff down in the substation, that may send a message up that says this is totally out of whack, and the main EMS system may actually start doing load shedding, where they're like, "Oh, the power grid's in trouble. Let's turn off a whole bunch of customers." And this is all done by automated things. Oh, good.
What kind of timeline were you looking at before these things so I could check and send hey, someone's in our system?
Someone's in our system. So I've actually done a few tests with that with live people, and I've never had somebody actually get to there must be a hacker in less than a few hours. But pretty much I'm good enough now that they just mostly don't say anything. I have some good, if you're interested in those, I have some presentations on how to do that. For instance, one of the things that you have to do when they're seeing time series data is if you come over there and you say like, "Oh, this thing's going," and then if you just line it out, so you just say, the value is 42. And it's 42 all the time. They're used to seeing this little up and down on the line, and see this near flatlining, and it's above the high, and so it's in the range, so it doesn't trigger any alarms. But no human is going to think that's real, and so you actually have to take the noise off and put the noise back on, and stuff like that. So there's a whole field around that, and so if you're interested, I do presentations on that, but in this case, I didn't have to do that because this scenario didn't do it. So the next thing I have to do is, we're going to have this fantasy world we're going to tell to the EMS system, and we're going to have the actual reality down there. So I'm going to make all my decisions on what I'm going to do based on these real world samples, but we want the fantasy world to go there. So we call these spoofing tables or bilateral tables, but that term was used by ICCP, so we had to unuse it. So in this case, everything in the substation that can be controlled, whether written to, set, or read, is a point. And most process control works off a point abstraction layer. So you can have a point 36 might be the voltage on this particular bus. Point number 37 could be the binary 1 or 0, whether or not the breaker is open. Point number 38 is something else. And so one of the things you have to do as an attacker is figure out what that point table is, so you know what you're talking to. So basically, we build 2 tables, and we put happy values in this one, and the actual real values in this one. And then when we're clocking the packets out, we decode the packet and we go look it up in the table. And if it's in our table, then we take out the haha, this is really bad, and we put in happy value, and we send happy value out, and the EMS is back into happy value land. kVA, kilovoltage amps. So basically like watts. Yeah, so so a lot of the measurements in substations are done in kVAs, which is 5 minutes. Oh, okay. I must go faster. Okay. Okay. So the next thing we've got to do is actually build the physics payload. And so when we're hacking industrial control systems, all of this is what we call the cyber payload. So now that I have control of it, we have to figure out which things that we're actually going to measure. We need to flip things off. We need to turn things on. We need to change settings, and that's called the physics payload. So I'm actually not going to cover the physics payload for this particular one because it's super bad and customers get grumbly when you talk about how you wreck their system. So I'm going to use a physics payload from another one so that's already been fixed and doesn't work this way anymore, so it's total fair game. And so the actual basics for this one is actually a 3-phase attack. And so if people don't know what a 3-phase attack is, so this was a 3-phase attack. So basically we've got 2 sine waves going in there, and if you swap really quickly between one sine wave and the other sine wave, then you get big torques on big spinny things. And so the target had a bunch of big spinny things, and we're going to go and try to make a bunch of torque on a big spinny thing. So in this case, what the point of this particular attack scenario is we're looking at islanding. And so in this case, we have a part of the grid that runs a bunch of houses and a part of the grid that runs some other houses in this great big factory. If you go into the switch yards, you can switch the things back and forth between different buses. And it's actually the physical connection that keeps all these 60 hertz waves going together. And so if you disconnect them, that's called islanding. And islands can drift in phase. And then if you slap them back together, you get these impulses on the electric grid. So here we have this nice factory, and this scenario is getting more and more as we go to renewables, because everybody's got these little solar farms over all over the place. And so you can actually open things up, and the solar farm will still run this part of the grid inside of the island. And so as things go up and down inside the island, that actually will change the phase. And so if you haven't seen a switch station, this is a switch station. It's just basically a whole bunch of bars, and basically contacts go whack, 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 and they switch the electricity back and forth. And so you can island it. So we're actually talking down to the substation, these little guys here that actually run out to these physical little things, and they whack things back and forth on the bars, and that's what switches things. And so most processes aren't equally vulnerable during all of their lifestyles. So this particular process was more vulnerable in the startup condition. So while they're starting the thing up, it's more vulnerable to attacks on big spinny things. So in that case, we come over there, and we need several things to happen all at once. We need this peaking generator to be running, and we also need this thing to be starting up. So we pull all the things out of the truth table in the middle here, we say that point number over there, if it's above that, that's great, that's great, that's great. And so we tried to take these points into bigger concepts like, is the generator running, or is this plant in startup? And so you basically run down through your truth table figure out what state, and you advance the state. And so when the generator is running and the plant's in startup, then we would enter the attack phase. And during the attack phase, we actually have to make sure that nobody's figured it out and turned things off, and things haven't gone horribly wrong, and the safety systems haven't kicked in and turned stuff off. And that's all done here in the truth tables. So the truth tables are big. I only have 1.7 kilobytes. And so a bunch of my time in this next one, which is kind of computer sciencey, was actually compressing them. So how I compress them is I don't need the whole truth table all the time. So when I'm waiting for the first plant to get online, I just need the comparisons in that table. And then when I switch to the next one, I just need the comparisons in the next table. And during the attack, I just need the entries in the next one. So what I did was I rearranged the table so it was highly regular. And then I used an algorithm called Berlekamp-Massey to turn that into the smallest linear feedback shift register, which is kind of a random number generator. So what I did was I made a random number generator that outputted all of the entries in my table. And so one of the reasons I did that is because a random number generator has an internal seed. So if I want to run forward in the generation of the table, I just have to store the one, in this case, 7-byte seed, and I chunk it into the middle of it, and I just clock the random number generator, and it paints over the top of my table with the chunk that I'm looking for. And so that gives me good compression, so I can actually fit this whole big truth table into the 1.7. So yes, and I'm just coming up to you. So then it was, we hit this into the let's do it. So I'm all done. And so during the previous engagement, I had compromised the patch and change management system. So I uploaded my new firmware to the patch management system. I uploaded a script that installed it and told it that, hey, these things need to be updated. And then the patch management system took care of installing all of the installing this to all of the various Moxa boxes at the site. And so chalked that one up, and then I moved on down to finding exploits for RTU to get down into the middle of it. And so that was kind of the first 14 hours of my thing. So so the reason that I did this is people have really weird ideas about how much stuff a professional gets done, what he does, and what things go. So way too many things are chalked up to big nation statey APT, big concepts, or these people guessed bad passwords. And so you get these weird things, but most of the time, if somebody's going to show up to actually damage your process or damage anything of real value to steal your money, it's going to be a professional, and it's going to be somebody that sits here and does this day in and day out. And while you probably can't pull out some firmware and read the firmware and find bugs and stuff, there are professionals that sit there and do this all day. I work with dozens of guys that could have done this on any given day. There's dozens of guys here in Idaho Falls that can do this on any given day. And kind of my grumbly with the reporters is that we've kind of lost that in our dialogue, is that we're all into these highly focused APT guys, or these random people that happen to guess my password and take advantage of these poorly configured things. And the dialogue for the guy that actually is most likely going to show up at your door, it's kind of being lost. And so yes, on the Jason doesn't have much time, so not much philosophy is so I wanted to get out here as this was a real world one. I randomly chose it before I started working on it, and this is what I got done in the first 14 hours of the engagement. Totally new box, and this is not unusual for me or any of the guys that I work with. We never bring an exploit library with us. So if we're going to go hack into some piece of critical infrastructure, we don't bring a whole bunch of things with us. We just come over there. We have a decompiler. We have some JTags and some serial debuggers and stuff like that, and a little case, and we go for it. And so this is for me a pretty typical day that goes in there. And I'd like to see a lot of the stuff come back to what's a professional going to do to me, rather than this infinite resource nation statey dude that's going to come and get us. So anyway, that's what I did. 14 hours, Power Grid.
One is that you have time for questions, although we're supposed to do the hot wash. But because he wants beer, that means if you're going to go get beer, you can probably ask him a question. Right? So as you're deciding whether or not to ask a question now, or later, we'll depend on whether or not you go. There you go. So,
yep.
Any questions? And that's like a lot of guys that know me say, so. I was going to keep this one up. But so the highly coveted piece, it's already been seen on the webs.
Oh,
so there's that, and Jason, as always, thank you so much. And one more time. And this portion, we are asking all of you to go and let's validate as we get outside where we're going to go to the hot wash. One person told me, "Oh, we're going to try and stay here." Huh? We're going to go back to where the keynote area. Okay, that was you. That's right. You
okay.
To stay here, so you're the one that's not telling me to go. So we're going to go. All right. So we're going to go back there because you guys need the fresh air.
Yep.
If you like